The registration clerk had 4 arms, 2 faces, and the kind of bureaucratic despair that transcends species. She looked at Osai's paperwork, looked at Osai, looked back at the paperwork. "You have no augmentations listed," she said. "That's right. No ritual conditioning, no genetic optimization, no performance modifications of any kind. Also right. You are applying to compete in the crucible." She said it the way you'd say, "You are attempting to swim through solid rock." Quame Osai had been awake for 19 hours. The transit from the Kepler relay had taken 11 of them, and the food dispensers on the shuttle had run out of anything recognizable around hour 4. He'd eaten a protein bar from his duffel bag in the shuttle docking bay. He had another one in his jacket pocket. He was thinking about that bar now, and about whether the clerk's second face, which hadn't spoken yet, had a different personality. "I'm applying to compete in the crucible," he confirmed. She stamped his forms. It sounded like a small explosion. The crucible's registration hall was large enough to produce its own weather. The ceiling was lost somewhere in a haze of recycled atmospheric gas. Around him, the galaxy's best, its engineered, augmented, ritually prepared best, moved through orientation with the practiced ease of beings who had been training for this specific event since before Osai had learned to ride a bicycle. The Dravathi moved in clusters, their 8 limbs articulating with a precision that Osai's brain kept trying to categorize as wrong. They were apex predators from a 2.1G world. Every joint in their bodies was a weapon. Their equivalent of a warm-up stretch looked like something that should require paramedics standing by. The Kethara stood apart. Or rather, one stood apart, which was the strange thing, because the Kethara were a hive-mind species, and individual separation was either a punishment or a deliberate act of will. This one was crystalline in structure, the light passing through its body in refractions that were almost certainly meaningful to other Kethara and were entirely opaque to Osai. It was watching him. All 3 of its visual apertures were pointed in his direction, with an attention that felt less like curiosity and more like data collection. Osai pulled the protein bar from his pocket and ate it. The hall went noticeably quieter. He'd been briefed, of course. You didn't accept a slot in the crucible without clearing the cultural sensitivity modules first. He knew that the registration hall was considered a sacred pre-competition space. He knew that consuming sustenance in it was the equivalent of his briefing notes had gotten creative here, eating a sandwich at a funeral. But the funeral was also a job interview. But the job was being the galaxy's most decorated competitive athlete. He finished the bar, folded the wrapper, put it in his pocket. The Kethara's 3 visual apertures had not moved. Osai nodded at it. It did not nod back. It was crystalline. He wasn't sure it had the architecture for nodding. He picked up his duffel bag and went to find his assigned quarters, which turned out to be a converted equipment room with a cot and a recycled air filtration unit that sounded, in the small hours, exactly like something dying slowly and philosophically. He slept fine. The first trial began at 600 local, which was a time that the station's environmental systems interpreted as morning weather, or not any of the 17 competing species shared that circadian preference. 12 champions on the starting grid. The endurance circuit in 1.4G ran for a distance that translated, roughly, to 11 kilometers with 200 meters of elevation, gain distributed across a course that had been specifically designed to exploit the physical weaknesses of as many species as possible. The gravity was calibrated to sit just below the threshold, where most of the competitors' home-world advantages stopped mattering. 1.4G was the great equalizer, or was meant to be. The Dravathi champion designated Primary 7 launched off the starting grid at a velocity that was, Osai thought, technically impressive and also technically insane. 2 of the Velhari, avian species, hollow bones, extraordinary burst capacity, pushed to keep pace. They were half a kilometer ahead within the first 3 minutes. Osai ran. Not fast, not particularly. He ran the way he'd been trained to run in long form, which was the way his ancestors had run across the savannah for tens of thousands of years before anyone had thought to put a stadium around it. Shoulders loose, breathing through the nose at a rate he could maintain, footfall measured and consistent. 1.4G pressed on him like a hand between his shoulder blades. He adjusted. The body adapted. That was what bodies did if you trained them long enough and refused to stop when they complained. At the 40-minute mark, the first Velhari dropped. She folded at the 7.2K marker with her wings pressing flat against her back, the avian equivalent of a white flag, and the course's medical drones descended immediately. Osai was in 9th place. At the 53-minute mark, Primary 7 began to slow, not from injury, from depletion. The Dravathi physiology had enormous power output and a correspondingly enormous metabolic cost. They burned bright and fast. Primary 7 had been burning bright for 53 minutes. Osai passed her at the 9.1K marker. He did not speed up to do it. She slowed, and he was simply still there, still moving at the same pace he had maintained since the starting grid. He finished last among the qualifiers. 6 champions had not finished. 6 had, he was the 6th. He sat on a bench at the finish line and drank a full liter of water, and then asked the race official whether there was food available at this hour. From 40 meters away, the Kethara observer, which had watched the entire trial from a raised platform, processed this information through the distributed network of its hive cluster. It had run the mathematics on the human's pace 20 minutes into the race. The calculation had been straightforward. At his established pace, accounting for fatigue modeling, he would finish. It had filed this finding with its cluster. The cluster had returned a query. Define waiting them out. It had tried to explain human persistence, pursuit predator evolution, a body that treated endurance as a metabolic baseline rather than an exceptional output. The cluster had returned another query. For what purpose does an organism evolve the capacity to simply not stop? The Kethara did not have a satisfying answer for that. It watched the human finish his water and ask about food again. A station attendant appeared with something wrapped in foil. The human received it with what its observation systems cataloged as genuine gratitude. He said something to the attendant that its translation implant rendered as, "You're a lifesaver." The Kethara filed this phrase under idiom, hyperbolic, non-literal, and continued to watch. The second trial had a formal name in the station's official documentation. Everyone called it the wreck. An 800-meter structure designed to collapse on a timed sequence with a signal beacon embedded in the center mass. You went in, you found the beacon, you got out. The structure did not care about your schedule. The falling debris did not issue warnings. The course designers had once described it, in a document Osai had found during his briefing research, as a simulation of a hostile architecture rescue extraction, which was the kind of institutional language that meant, "We made a building that tries to kill you, good luck." The 12 remaining competitors entered at staggered intervals. Os went in 4th. The air inside tasted like metal shavings and burnt cabling. He cataloged this and moved. The structure groaned around him. Somewhere ahead, something large and concrete adjacent gave way with a sound like a planet clearing its throat. He adjusted his route by 30 degrees and kept moving. He was at the 400-meter interior mark when Primary 7 came through a connecting corridor at full sprint, 8 limbs, full acceleration, the terrifying fluid motion of a species that had no redundant joints, and they occupied the same space briefly. Or rather, Primary 7's leftmost forelimb occupied the same space as Osai's right shoulder, and the physics of the situation resolved the way physics generally does when a Dravathi in full sprint contacts a stationary human. He hit the wall. The wall hit back. His right shoulder informed him with considerable specificity that something had gone wrong with it. He stopped, assessed. The shoulder was dislocated, he could feel the joint sitting wrong, could feel the precise geography of the misalignment. He looked at the wall, pressed his shoulder against it, took a breath in. Reset it. The sound was not pleasant. The sensation was less pleasant. He catalogued both and kept moving. Primary 7 had not stopped. She was already 50 meters ahead. He did not hold this against her. There was a building falling down. It was not the moment for social niceties. He found the beacon at the 510-meter mark, retrieved it. The structure chose this moment to drop approximately 400 kilograms of secondary material through the floor above. He moved left. The debris landed where he'd been standing. He kept his eyes on the exit vector and moved. He came out of the wreck at a measured pace, beacon in hand, bleeding from a cut along his left forearm where a falling edge had caught him, and from something on the back of his head he hadn't noticed until the exterior light hit it. He handed the beacon to the trial official. "You're injured," the official said. "Yes," Osai said. "Your shoulder, the joint was dislocated. Our sensors registered the incident." "I know." "You continued the trial." "Yes." The official stared at him for a moment with the particular expression of someone whose species had a word for this that did not translate cleanly into galactic standard. He marked Osai's form. Qualified. On the observation platform, the Kethara had watched the shoulder incident through the structure's interior sensors, had watched the reset, had processed the data twice because the first pass had returned a result that appeared to be an error. In Kethara physiology, crystalline, structured, each component dependent on the integrity of the whole, a joint failure of the kind the human had sustained was a cascade event. It triggered systemic shutdown protocols. It was survivable only with immediate intervention. The human had intervened on himself, against a wall, in the middle of a collapsing structure, and then continued. The Kethara's hive cluster went quiet for 3.2 seconds. 3.2 seconds was, in Kethara collective processing, equivalent to what other species might describe as stunned silence. The cluster had encountered something that its models did not account for. It filed a new assessment in place of the threat matrix it had been building since the registration hall. Hypothesis: human pain threshold non-standard. Counter-hypothesis: human pain threshold standard. Human tolerance of pain threshold non-standard. Sub-question: is there a meaningful distinction? The cluster did not reach consensus. It continued to watch. The gauntlet was the Crucible's oldest and least subtle event. An open field, 2 kilometers across, with 12 objectives distributed across terrain that was modified in real time by the course systems. No teams, no alliances, no cooperation required or expected. You ran the objectives in whatever order you chose, collected them, brought them to the center point. The champion who brought the most objectives to the center point in the allotted time won the Crucible. 400 years of competition. 1,132 gauntlets completed. The record was held by a Velhari champion from 60 years prior who had processed 7 of 12 objectives in a single run. Osai read the briefing the night before while eating from a ration pack and listening to the filtration unit die its slow philosophical death. He was not thinking about strategy, particularly. He was thinking about the Dravathi champion, Primary 7, who had dislocated his shoulder and had then, 2 hours later in the competitor's dining facility, placed a small wrapped object on the table in front of him without making eye contact and moved away. He'd unwrapped it, a compressed nutritive block, Dravathi equivalent of a protein bar. He'd eaten it. It tasted like iron filings and something that might have been, in a parallel universe where taste was subjective, pine. He was thinking about that now, the transaction of it, no words, no explanation, he hadn't expected one. The gauntlet began at 800. Osai took the eastern route, working methodically toward the three objectives clustered near the field's far edge. His shoulder was functional. He'd spent 40 minutes with the medical station's automated systems the previous evening, and the joint had been properly stabilized. It ached. He cataloged the ache and ran. He reached his first objective at the 9-minute mark, retrieved it, moved to the second. At the 17-minute mark, the course systems modified the central terrain, a standard escalation, nothing unexpected. He adjusted his route. Primary 7 flashed past him on a parallel line, all 8 limbs in the air simultaneously between strides. He reached his second objective. He heard it before he saw it, a sound specific to structural failure, which he now recognized the way you recognize the smell of rain before it arrives. A mass of course material had come down on the north sector, not a scheduled modification. The course system's indicator lights were cycling amber, not green. One of the competitors was down. He could see the shape of it from his position, a figure under the debris, not moving, the particular stillness that was different from resting. He ran the math without deciding to. The fallen competitor was Primary 7. He was 90 meters away. He had one objective in hand. The center point was 400 meters in the opposite direction. He ran toward Primary 7. The debris was 3 layers deep in places. He started at the outside edge and worked inward, moving pieces in the systematic order that structural analysis suggested: largest anchor pieces first, then clear the secondary fall, then access the point of maximum compression. His shoulder informed him with renewed specificity about its objections. He cataloged them. 7 minutes. It took 7 minutes, which was not a long time, except that it was a very long time to be under a debris field. He found her. Primary 7 was conscious. Her eyes were open, which in Dravathi physiology indicated consciousness, though not necessarily coherence. 3 of her 8 limbs were pinned. He assessed the vectors and began removing the last layer. He had been aware in an ambient way that the gauntlet had gone quiet. He was aware now that it had stopped entirely. He did not look up. "I'm going to pull you out," he said. She might not have had a translation implant at full function. He said it anyway. "This is going to hurt. I'm sorry about that." He pulled. She made a sound that his translation implant handled only partially, rendering the rest as untranslatable pain vocalization, Dravathi. He got her clear of the debris and supported her weight with his functional arm. She was heavy. He moved anyway. He walked her to the gauntlet's edge. The medical team met them 20 meters out. He handed her off, turned back toward the field. The allotted time had elapsed. The course systems had registered end of event 4 minutes prior. The center point was still 400 meters away. He had one objective. The gauntlet's result board showed Osai, Quame, 1 objective retrieved. Every other active competitor had retrieved between 3 and 5. He walked back toward the competitor's area alone. Around him, in the observation galleries in the field from the other competitors, nothing moved. The Kethara stood on the platform where it had stood for 4 days and tried to process what its cluster had witnessed. In 400 years of gauntlet history, no competitor had ever stopped. The gauntlet had no rule against stopping. It had simply never happened. The event's entire architecture, 4 centuries of course design, scoring methodology, strategic analysis, had been built on the axiom that competitors compete, that the objective of competition is to win, that the cost of stopping is the gauntlet, and the gauntlet is everything you trained for. The human had done the math. He had to have done the math. He had been functional, bearing objectives, in a competitive position. The math of the situation returned one clear answer. And he had stopped anyway. The Kethara's cluster had been running cost-benefit analysis on this decision for the 7 minutes it had taken the human to remove the debris. It had run it across 4 different modeling frameworks. It had borrowed processing capacity from 3 adjacent cluster nodes. There was no version of the calculus that produced stopping as the correct answer. Unless the inputs were different from what the Kethara had assumed. Unless, for the human, the cost-benefit analysis included a variable that the Kethara had not been modeling. Unless what the human was optimizing for was not what the Kethara thought it was. It watched Osai walk across the empty field, one objective in hand. The field behind him was perfectly still. Primary 7 was alive. The medical team's initial assessment had already come through the observation network. Alive. Functional. A Dravathi whose species had spent 1100 years competing in this hall, who had never in that time been carried out of the gauntlet by a competitor. The Kethara opened its threat assessment file. The file it had started in the registration hall 4 days ago when the unaugmented human had arrived with a duffel bag and eaten a protein bar in a sacred space. It deleted the file, opened a new one, filed a single entry where the threat matrix had been. Designation: Osai Quame species human. Category kin. Osai reached the competitor's area and sat on a bench and asked the nearest station attendant if there was anything to eat. There was. The attendant brought it without being asked twice. He ate. The hall was still quiet around him. He didn't seem to find this strange. He had one objective and last place in the gauntlet and a shoulder that would ache for another 2 weeks, and somewhere on the other side of the station, a Dravathi was alive who had given him a protein bar the previous evening, which was probably not the causal chain anyone had anticipated when they designed this competition. He finished eating and looked up at the observation gallery and found the Kethara and nodded at it. The Kethara, after a moment, resolved a small aperture in its crystalline structure, the closest its anatomy allowed to a nod. Osai packed up his duffel bag. Outside, through the station's observation ports, the stars had not moved. They had the patience of things that have been burning for a very long time and intend to keep burning, which Osai had always found, in a general way, relatable. He went to find food that was better than iron filings and something like pine.